Inuit are a group of culturally similar indigenous peoples inhabiting the Arctic regions of Greenland, Canada, and Alaska. Inuit is a plural noun, the singular is Inuk. The oral Inuit languages are classified in the Eskimo-Aleutian family, whereas Inuit Sign Language is a critically endangered language isolate spoken in Nunavut. In the United States and Canada, the term Eskimo was commonly used to describe the Inuit, and Alaska's Yupik and Inuktitut. Inuit is not accepted as a term for the Yupik, and Eskimo is the only term that includes Yupik, Inuktitut and Inuit. However, Aboriginal peoples in Canada and Greenland view Eskimo as pejorative, and Inuit has become more common. In Canada, Sections 25 and 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 named the Inuit as a distinctive group of Aboriginal Canadians who are not included under either the First Nations or the Inuktitut. The Inuit live throughout most of the Canadian Arctic and subarctic in the territory of Nunavut, in the northern third of Quebec, înu'inuit, and Nunatikamut in Labrador, and in various parts of the Northwest Territories, particularly around the Arctic Ocean. These areas are known in Inuktitut as the Inuit înu'inuit. In the United States, Inuktitut live on the North Slope in Alaska and on Little Diomede Island. The Greenlandic Inuit are the descendants of migrations from Canada and are citizens of Denmark, although not of the European Union. Prehistory. Inuit are the descendants of what anthropologists call the Thule culture, who emerged from western Alaska around 1000 CE, and spread eastwards across the Arctic. They displaced the related Dorset culture, the last major Paleo-Eskimo culture. Inuit legends speak of the înu'ight as giants, people who were taller and stronger than the Inuit. Less frequently, the legends refer to the Dorset as dwarfs. Researchers believe that the Dorset culture lacked dogs, larger weapons and other technologies that gave the expanding Inuit society an advantage. By 1300, the Inuit had settled in West Greenland, and they moved into East Greenland over the following century. Faced with population pressures from the Thule and other surrounding groups, such as the Algonquin and Siouan to the south, the înu'ight gradually receded. They were thought to have become completely extinct as a people by about 1400 or 1500. But, in the mid-1950s, researcher Henry B. Collins determined that, based on the ruins found at Native Point, the Sadlermiut were likely the last remnants of the Dorset culture. The Sadlermiut population survived up until winter 1902-3, when exposure to new infectious diseases brought by contact with Europeans led to their extinction as a people. More recently, mitochondrial DNA research has supported the theory of continuity between the înu'ight and the Sadlermiut. It also has provided evidence that a population displacement did not occur within the Aleutian Islands between the Dorset and Thule transition. In contrast to other înu'ight populations, the Aleutian Sadlermiut benefited from both geographical isolation and their ability to adopt certain Thule technologies. In Canada and Greenland, Inuit circulated almost exclusively north of the Arctic tree line, the effective southern border of Inuit society. The most southern, officially recognized, Inuit community in the world is Rigolette in înu'inuit, south of înu'inuit. The descendants of the southern Labrador Inuit in Nunatikamut continued their traditional transhumant semi-nomadic way of life until the mid-1900s. The Nunatikamut were usually spread out among islands and bays and therefore did not establish stationary communities. In other areas south of the tree line, Native American cultures were well established. The culture and technology of Inuit society that served so well in the Arctic were not suited to subarctic regions, so they did not displace their southern neighbors. Inuit had trade relations with more southern cultures, boundary disputes were common and gave rise to aggressive actions. Warfare was not uncommon among those Inuit groups with sufficient population density. Inuit such as the ʻInuktitut who inhabited the Mackenzie River Delta area often engaged in warfare. The more sparsely settled Inuit in the central Arctic, however, did so less often. Their first European contact was with the Vikings who settled in Greenland and explored the eastern Canadian coast. The Norse sagas recorded meeting Skraelingar, probably an undifferentiated label for all the Native Americans whom the Norse encountered, whether ʻɪnuːɪt, Inuit, or Buthuq. After about 1350, the climate grew colder during the period known as the Little Ice Age. During this period, Alaskan natives were able to continue their whaling activities, but Inuit were forced to abandon their hunting and whaling sites in the high Arctic as bowhead whales disappeared from Canada and Greenland. These Inuit then had to subsist on a much poorer diet in addition to losing access to essential raw materials for their tools and architecture, previously derived from whaling. The changing climate forced Inuit to work their way south, forcing them into marginal niches along the edges of the tree line. These were areas which Native Americans had not occupied or where they were weak enough for coexistence with Inuit. Researchers have difficulty defining when Inuits stopped territorial expansion. There is evidence that they were still moving into new territory in southern Labrador when they first began to interact with Europeans in the 17th century. Post-contact history. Canada. Early contact with Europeans. The lives of Paleo-Eskimos of the far north were largely unaffected by the arrival of visiting Norsemen except for mutual trade. Labrador Inuit have had the longest continuous contact with Europeans. After the disappearance of the Norse colonies in Greenland, the Inuit had no contact with Europeans for at least a century. By the mid-16th century, Basque whalers and fishermen were already working the Labrador coast and had established whaling stations on land, such as the one that has been excavated at Red Bay. The Inuit appear not to have interfered with their operations, but they raided the stations in winter for tools and items made of worked iron, which they adapted to their own needs. Martin Frobisher's 1576 search for the Northwest Passage was the first well-documented post-Columbian contact between Europeans and Inuit. Frobisher's expedition landed in Frobisher Bay, Baffin Island, not far from the settlement now called the city of Inuktitut, which was long known as Frobisher Bay. Frobisher encountered Inuit on Resolution Island, where 5 sailors left the ship, under orders from Frobisher, and became part of Inuit mythology. The homesick sailors, tired of their adventure, attempted to leave in a small vessel and vanished. Frobisher brought an unwilling Inuk to England, possibly the first Inuk ever to visit Europe. The Inuit oral tradition, in contrast, recounts the natives helping Frobisher's crewmen, whom they believed had been abandoned. The semi-nomadic eco-centered Inuit were fishers and hunters harvesting lakes, seas, ice platforms and tundra. While there are some allegations that Inuit were hostile to early French and English explorers, fishers and whalers, more recent research suggests that the early relations with whaling stations along the Labrador coast and later James Bay were based on a mutual interest in trade. In the final years of the 18th century, the Moravian Church began missionary activities in Labrador, supported by the British who were tired of the raids on their whaling stations. The Moravian missionaries could easily provide the Inuit with the iron and basic materials they had been stealing from whaling outposts, materials whose real cost to Europeans was almost nothing, but whose value to the Inuit was enormous, and from then on contacts in Labrador were far more peaceful. The European arrival tremendously damaged the Inuit way of life, causing mass death through new diseases introduced by whalers and explorers, and enormous social disruptions caused by the distorting effect of Europeans' material wealth. Nonetheless, Inuit society in the higher latitudes had largely remained in isolation during the 19th century. The Hudson's Bay Company opened trading posts such as Great Whale River, today the site of the twin villages of Wapmagustwi and Kujuara Peak, where whale products of the commercial whale hunt were processed and furs traded. The British naval expedition of 1821-3 led by Admiral William Edward Parry, which twice overwintered in Fox Basin, provided the first informed, sympathetic and well-documented account of the economic, social and religious life of the Inuit. Parry stayed in what is now Igloolik over the second winter. Parry's writings, with pen and ink illustrations of Inuit everyday life, and those of George Francis Lyon, both published in 1824, were widely read. Captain George Comer's Inuit wife Shufli, known for her sewing skills and elegant attire, was influential in convincing him to acquire more sewing accessories and beads for trade with Inuit. Early 20th century. During the early 20th century, a few traders and missionaries circulated among the more accessible bands, and after 1904 they were accompanied by a handful of Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Unlike most Aboriginal peoples in Canada, however, the lands occupied by the Inuit were of little interest to European settlers. To the Southerners, the homeland of the Inuit was a hostile hinterland. Southerners enjoyed lucrative careers as bureaucrats and service providers to the north, but very few ever chose to visit there. Canada, with its more hospitable lands largely settled, began to take a greater interest in its more peripheral territories, especially the fur and mineral-rich hinterlands. By the late 1920s, there were no longer any Inuit who had not been contacted by traders, missionaries or government agents. In 1939, the Supreme Court of Canada found, in a decision known as Re Eskimos, that the Inuit should be considered Indians and were thus under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Native customs were worn down by the actions of the RCMP, who enforce Canadian criminal law on Inuit, such as kikik, who often could not understand what they had done wrong, and by missionaries who preached a moral code very different from the one they were used to. Many of the Inuit were systematically converted to Christianity in the 19th and 20th centuries, through rituals like the Sikitig. Second World War to the 1960s. World War II and the Cold War made Arctic Canada strategically important for the first time, and, thanks to the development of modern aircraft, accessible year-round. The construction of air bases and the distant early warning line in the 1940s and 1950s brought more intensive contacts with European society, particularly in the form of public education, which traditionalists complained instilled foreign values disdainful of the traditional structure of Inuit society. In the 1950s, the high Arctic relocation was undertaken by the Government of Canada for several reasons. These were to include protecting Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic, alleviating hunger, and attempting to solve the Eskimo problem, meaning the assimilation and end of the Inuit culture. One of the more notable relocations was undertaken in 1953, when 17 families were moved from Port Harrison to Resolute and Grisefjord. They were dropped off in early September when winter had already arrived. The land they were sent to was very different from that in the Inuktitut area. It was barren, with only a couple of months when the temperature rose above freezing and several months of polar night. The families were told by the RCMP they would be able to return within 2 years if conditions were not right. However, 2 years later more families were relocated to the high Arctic, and it was to be 30 years before they were able to visit Inuktitut. By 1953, Canada's Prime Minister Louis Street Laurent publicly admitted, "Apparently we have administered the vast territories of the North in an almost continuing absence of mind." The government began to establish about 40 permanent administrative centres to provide education, health and economic development services. Inuit from hundreds of smaller camps scattered across the north began to congregate in these hamlets. Regular visits from doctors, and access to modern medical care raised the birth rate and decreased the death rate, causing an enormous natural increase. In the 1950s, the Canadian government began to actively settle Inuit into permanent villages and cities, occasionally against their will. These forced resettlements were acknowledged by the Canadian government in 2005. By the mid-1960s, encouraged first by missionaries, then by the prospect of paid jobs and government services, and finally forced by hunger and required by police, most Canadian Inuit lived year-round in permanent settlements. The nomadic migrations that were the central feature of Arctic life had become a much smaller part of life in the north. The Inuit, a once self-sufficient people in an extremely harsh environment, were, in the span of perhaps 2 generations, transformed into a small, impoverished minority, lacking skills or resources to sell to the larger economy, but increasingly dependent on it for survival. Although anthropologists like Diamond Jennis were quick to predict that Inuit culture was facing extinction, Inuit political activism was already emerging. Cultural renewal. In the 1960s, the Canadian government funded the establishment of secular, government-operated high schools in the Northwest Territories and Inuit areas in Quebec and Labrador, along with the residential school system. The Inuit population was not large enough to support a full high school in every community, so this meant only a few schools were built, and students from across the territories were boarded there. These schools, Inuktitut, ʻɪnuːɪt, Yellowknife, Inuvik and ʻɪnjuːɪt, brought together young Inuit from across the Arctic in one place for the first time, and exposed them to the rhetoric of civil and human rights that prevailed in Canada in the 1960s. This was a real wake-up call for the Inuit, and it stimulated the emergence of a new generation of young Inuit activists in the late 1960s who came forward and pushed for respect for the Inuit and their territories. The Inuit began to emerge as a political force in the late 1960s and early 1970s, shortly after the first graduates returned home. They formed new politically active associations in the early 1970s, starting with the Inuit Tapirisit of Canada, an outgrowth of the Indian and Eskimo Association of the 60s, in 1971, and more region-specific organizations shortly afterwards, including the Committee for the Original Peoples Entitlement, the Northern Quebec Inuit Association and the Labrador Inuit Association representing Northern Labrador Inuit. Since the mid-1980s, the Southern Labrador Inuit of Inuktitut began organizing politically after being geographically cut out of the LEA. However, for political expediency, the organization was erroneously called the Labrador Inuktitut Nation. These various activist movements began to change the direction of Inuit society in 1975 with the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. This comprehensive land claims settlement for Quebec Inuit, along with a large cash settlement and substantial administrative autonomy in the new region of Nunavut, set the precedent for the settlements to follow. The Northern Labrador Inuit submitted their land claim in 1977, although they had to wait until 2005 to have a signed land settlement establishing ʻɪnuktitut. Southern Labrador Inuit of Inuktitut are currently in the process of establishing land claims and title rights that would allow them to negotiate with the Newfoundland government. Canada's 1982 Constitution Act recognized the Inuit as Aboriginal peoples in Canada, but not First Nations. In the same year, the Tungavik Federation of Nunavut was incorporated, in order to take over negotiations for land claims on behalf of the Inuit living in the Eastern Northwest Territories. That would later become Nunavut, from the Inuit Tapirisit Kanatami, which became a joint association of the Inuit of Quebec, Labrador and the Northwest Territories. Inuit cabinet members at the federal level. On October 30, 2008, Leona Aglukkaq was appointed as Minister of Health, becoming the first Inuk to hold a senior cabinet position. Although she is not the first Inuk to be in cabinet altogether, Jack Anawake and Nancy Carey Take Lindell were both parliamentary secretaries. respectively from 1993 to 1996 and in 2003. Nomenclature. In the United States, the term Eskimo is still commonly used, because it includes Inuit, Aleut, Inuktitut, and Yupik peoples whilst distinguishing them from American Indians. The Yupik do not speak an Inuit language or consider themselves to be Inuit. It is now considered pejorative or even a racial slur amongst the Canadian and English-speaking Greenlandic Inuit. In Canada and Greenland, Inuit is preferred. Inuit is the Eastern Canadian Inuit and West Greenlandic word for the people, since Inuktitut and Kalaallisut are the prestige dialects in Canada and Greenland, respectively. Their version has become dominant, although every Inuit dialect uses cognates from the Proto-Eskimo *inu, for example. People is ʻɪnuːɪt in North Greenlandic and ʻɪnuit in East Greenlandic.